In this section, we're going to be going over how to export your terrain for the previous delivery. So I have this well creator terrain that I built, and we want to go ahead and go into the export preferences and hit the little plus icon here. Then that'll bring up a folder. In this folder, you also want to hit the plus icon and select height map. Now we're just going to go over height map for this tutorial. I'll cover color maps later on. So select the height map option, and from your drop down select EXR. Make sure that you have float 32 selected. Then make sure normalize is turned on, and make sure you have Unreal selected. Then you're going to go ahead and hit export. Before you do, make sure that your resolution is set to 4096 pixels by 4096 pixels. You can go higher than that, just be mindful that you may have issues or it may take forever to export. You can also go lower than that if you want, but that's my recommended pixel resolution for your exports. So now once that's done, you're going to hit the open export folder. That will open up your Windows Explorer. Let me bring that window up one second. Here we go. So that's where all my textures, all my exports are going to live. Okay. All right. So that is all we need to do from World Creator. We're going to move on to the next step, which is Nuke. So let me bring that up and go ahead and drag in your file into your Node Explorer. Close this guy out. Now in here, the first thing you want to do is with your mouse in the node graph and hit the S key. That'll bring in your project settings. Now in project settings, you want to go and scroll down to the full size format, select the drop down menu there, and go all the way to the bottom. You'll see the 4096 by 4096 option. Now, you'll notice that if I zoom out, my format size is 4096 by 4096. You want to hit tab with the mouse over the node graph and make a constant. So search for a constant, make that. Then you want to change from the properties bin, change that to RGBA, and move the slider all the way to 1, or you can just enter 1 as a value. That'll give you a 1 across the board in the red, green, blue, and alpha. Okay. Now with that selected in your viewer, and you can do so by selecting the read node, or in this case selecting the constant, and pressing the 1 on your keyboard, and that'll bring it up on the viewport. Now what we want to do is select that constant node and hit T, or make a transform node. And then over here in the properties bin, you want to bring that scale down to 0.99. And if I zoom in here, you'll see that there's a few pixels on the edge, and that's exactly what we want. Because what we want to do from here is we want to make a merge node, and I'm going to do so by hitting the M key over the node graph, and I want to plug that mask into the A input and my height map into the B inputs. I'm going to attach my viewer to that by hitting 1 while I have the merge node selected. And then from the drop down menu, I'm going to change that to a mask. And now if you can see, we've taken away the edges. So if I toggle between both, that's what we're doing with this mask. We're making sure that when this image is used for this placement, it doesn't displace the border, so that the border can be at 0 in XYZ space. All right? Awesome. So now an additional step, you don't have to do this part, but I like to do it, is make a sharpen node over here underneath your height map. Now, if you are using the toolkit that I had you guys set up, if you don't have that at home, you can Google search for Nuke Survival Toolkit. There's a video on YouTube that goes through the installation for doing it at your house. But if you have that installed and you hit tab with the mouse over the node graph, you can type in x_sharpen, and that'll bring up this special sharpen node. I like it better than the Nuke sharpen node, but I'll make a Nuke default sharpen node. All right, so here's the difference between both. You can see that the X sharpen is a little bit better. You can crank the settings up on the sharpen, but it tends to give you some funky artifacting around the edges. That's why I like the X sharpen better. And the whole point of using this is so that you get some additional detail on all that fine sculpting that you did in World Creator once you go into this placing it. So now that we have that set up, we'll go ahead and make a right node, and you can do so by just hitting the W key in with the mouse over the node graph. That'll make a right, or you can just hit tab and search for right node. Either one works. So I'll go ahead and double click on my right node to bring in my properties bin, and then over here you want to path that to wherever your work directory is at, which is landscape, and I'll call this height map underscore 4K dot EXR. Okay, I'm using that because it's a 4K map that I'm exporting, and it's an EXR format type. That's the file extension you want to type in. You want to hit save. Now, if you did that correctly, the right node will update, and it'll know that you're using an EXR. That's what you want to write out. And here on the properties bin, you want to change the data type from 16-bit to 32-bit float. Now, once that is done, you want to go ahead and hit render and hit OK. And that'll render out the height map you'll be using in the next step of this tutorial. Now, as a side note here, if you are working ahead and you want to take this into Unreal, you want to make sure that you make a separate right node here. And we're going to change that to a 2K PNG. Hit enter. It'll change your right node properties to a PNG instead. And in the data type, you want to change that to 16-bit. You also want to make sure that you downrest this to match the 2K size. So do so by hitting tab and bringing in a reformat node. Now with the reformat node selected in your properties bin, select the output format drop-down option and hit new. And then on new here, type in 2160 by 2160, which is the max resolution that landscapes will take in Unreal if you want Nanite to work. At least in this version of Unreal, that's the most stable. If you go anything higher than this, currently you'll have some issues with Nanite. So I'll call this Unreal format and hit OK. And now if you view through that, you'll see that your format is getting changed to 2160 by 2160 from the original 4096 by 4096. And I'll go ahead and write this out too. That way you just have both in there for future use. All right. Now that concludes the Nuke portion of the tutorial. So I'm gonna switch over to Blender. So now here we are in Blender. If you haven't used Blender before, if you hold middle mouse click, you can kind of rotate around your cursor. If you hold shift and middle mouse click, you can pan around. You really don't need much more than that, other than maybe zooming in and out with your middle mouse wheel scroll. Okay, so now that we know that, we're going to left click this box and we're going to hit delete, the delete key on your keyboard to get rid of it. And we're going to go up to the add menu, select mesh, make a plane. We're going to make sure that plane is selected, and on the right hand side I'm going to click and drag down so I can select all three values, and I'm going to type in 10. That way I have a 10 meter by 10 meter scale plane. And now I'm going to go and change the edit mode on the top left, and I'm going to, with my mouse over the plane, I'm going to right click and select subdivide. That's going to bring up this window on the bottom left. I'm going to expand that, and I'm going to change the number of cuts to 100 and hit enter. That's going to subdivide my plane so it has some geometry there to displace. So now that that's done, I'm going to switch back to object mode, and I'm going to go here to the right hand side and select the modifiers icon. I'm going to add a modifier and search for displace. That's my displacement modifier. Now I'm going to hit new, and again scroll down to the bottom here where there's a texture icon. Select the texture icon and hit the open button and navigate to where you saved that texture. So let me copy that path really quick. And I'm going to use the 4K EXR for this portion. Okay, so now that that is selected, you'll see that your terrain is getting displaced. So still a little low res, so we're going to go back up to the modifier, and we're going to add another modifier called subdivision surface. And once that's made, make sure that you layer it properly. So if you select these little dots on the top right of that modifier, you can click and drag it to the top. And now you can increase the resolution or the subdivision amount of your terrain. And by doing so, you can see that you're getting a lot more detail out of your terrain here. So in this case, for this shot, the character will be really close, so I want to crank this up quite a bit. That's feeling pretty good. You can also right click here and shade smooth. I just right clicked on the terrain and selected the shade smooth option. All right, so if I'm happy with this amount, and you can mess around with the displacement amount, if that's too much, I can tone down the amount of displacement strength. 0.9, I can go to 0.5 here. So if you're curious what mid-level is set to, right now I'm displacing an equal amount up and down from the middle ground. If I set this to 0, I'm only displacing in one direction versus in both. I suggest you just keep that at 0.5 and you just mess around with strength. You can always place the terrain at a later time where you want it. So I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. It looks like a path. It makes sense to what I'm going to be using it for. It looks really close to what I was using in World Creator, and I can double check that by going back to my World Creator scene. So as you guys can see, looks pretty close. So I'm going to go ahead and say that's okay for me. So go ahead and save this file just in case you plan on going back to it. I'll call this height map. Can't spell today. Height map pre-bake. And save that. And I called it pre-bake because this is what we're going to do next. We're going to bake this down. So you can bake that down by right-clicking the mesh and going to convert to and select the mesh option. Now give it a few because it's gonna be thinking and baking down all those modifiers. So as you can tell by doing so, all the modifiers from the right-hand side are now gone. I've baked this down. It is now one solid slab of geometry, and I can see how dense it is by going to the top right in the viewport overlays and selecting the statistics option, which is off by default, and I have a 10 million faces by 10 million faces, or 10 million faces total, sorry, on the plane, which is pretty dense. If you're working in Maya, this might be crashing your Maya scene or making it impossible to even open it up. If you're in Blender, as you can tell, it's still running pretty smooth, so you can give it a shot. I don't work in Blender that much, so I don't know how stable that'll be in Blender, but you can certainly give it a shot. And if you are working in Unreal and you're using static meshes, Nanite can help you out a lot. That would still be a really giant file in terms of like storage space. You're looking at probably a few gigabytes. So I would highly recommend you downres that, and this is the main reason why I like to use Blender, because now in the next step we're going to add a decimate modifier. And do not scroll this value, the ratio, or you're going to be sitting here forever. Just left mouse click. And in this case, since it's 10 million, I want to be closer to maybe around 1 million, perhaps even a little less than that, maybe 500,000, 750,000. So I'll type in 0.075. So it's math. If you want to do some math, you can figure that out, but that's going to get me closer to 750,000. So I'll hit enter and just wait and be patient. All right, I crashed, so I'm picking this back up from the pre-bake section. So we're here before we baked it. So I'm going to right click again, convert to mesh. Now I'm going to add the decimate modifier. In this case, I didn't subdivide it as much, so we can go a little bit quicker. Go to 0.1. Okay. I know this is a little bit too much. This is the part that takes a little bit of back and forth until you're happy with the amount of detail you're keeping. Do keep in mind that you're still able to apply displacement via textures on top of this terrain, so you don't have to have all the crazy amount of detail on here. This is probably a little bit too soft for my taste. I would probably go back and pick somewhere maybe a 0.25 or 0.3, but you want to find a medium ground so that it still has some shape to it, which this already does have a pretty decent amount. So you can add your textures later on to add some additional displacement. And then on top of that, for anything in the foreground, you want to download some Quixel or Megascan assets or any other assets that are higher res that'll hold up closer to the camera. But for now, for the purposes of the tutorial, 500,000 is okay for me. So I'm going to right click and convert this to a mesh, which will bake down or decimate. All right, now that that's done, just make sure you are set to shade smooth. And now that we're done with that, you can save this file as a post-bake file. That way, in case you crash while you're exporting, you at least have all that done already in your file. So now that you're ready to export, go up to the top left, hit File, Export, FBX, and then on the right-hand side here, scroll down until you see the geometry options, expand that, scroll down even further, and make sure that tangent space is checked on. Now navigate. Right now I'm already set to the location where I want to export, so I'll change this to landscape underscore geo. You can name this whatever you want, but once you're ready, just hit export FBX, and you'll have an FBX that you can bring into your software of choice. If you're going to bring it into Unreal, make sure you convert it to a nanite. You can place it wherever you need. If you're going to stay in Blender, at this point, you can scale this to be the accurate size of your terrain, because remember, we left it at 10 meters by 10 meters, but if this is closer to 100 feet, then you would do that math, like open up Google and search meters to feet, and then scale it properly so that you have proper scale. All right, I'll see you guys on the next one.